Good evening, everyone. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's here. I have my friends and family here, and equally grateful for anyone who's new to the Lowe, who's new to coming to see us and new to this experience. And with that, I'm just going to get right into my talk. So the purpose of my talk tonight is to elucidate the meaning and history of this three-paneled altarpiece, or triptych, which is attributed to the 14th Sienese painter Lowe. The altarpiece is on permanent display through the glass doors in the adjacent gallery, and you're welcome to view it after my lecture. The altarpiece was made around the year 1340, most likely 1343 or 1344, and it can be connected to a complicated set of political circumstances that has to do with the succession of the Angevin dynasty that ruled the city of Naples from 1266 to 1442. At the time, Naples was the capital city of a kingdom, the only kingdom in Italy, that included all of the southern Italian peninsula. Much of the conflict surrounding this altarpiece results from the unusual circumstance of a woman, Queen Johanna I, acceding the throne of Naples as the sole ruler. The structure of my talk will be a series of questions that will guide us through the key information about this work of art. Even though we don't have the time to take questions from the podium at the conclusion of my talk, I hope that you can imagine this presentation as a form of dialogue as you listen. And I will be happy to continue the conversation at the reception that will follow our program. First, we will talk about the altarpiece itself and the meaning of the materials that it's made from. And then we will take on the royal intrigue that surrounded its production. So our first question would be, where did the work of art come from, and how did it get here to Naples, Florida? So this altarpiece is one of 48 works of art that were donated to the Lowe Art Museum by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation in 1961. Samuel H. Kress was the father of a retail empire that was a major part of American material culture and social history in the early to mid-20th century. Especially as we are grateful to the Kress Foundation for its support of tonight's event, we will begin with the story of their founder. In the 1880s, Samuel H. Kress, you can see here at the left of the back row of this family portrait, in the 1880s, he was a teacher in a one-room Pennsylvania schoolhouse where he made $25 a month. Eventually, he saved enough money to buy a small stationery store to supplement his income. His venture prospered, allowing him to become a wholesaler. This laid the groundwork for a nationwide empire that began with the opening of the first Kress 5 & Dime store in Memphis, Tennessee in 1896. S.H. Kress & Company would eventually consist of over 200 stores that anchored the Main Street shopping districts of American cities from Miami all the way to Honolulu. The years between 1929 and 1944 were a golden age for the company that was represented by a series of Art Deco-style stores designed by the architect Edward Sibber. In the early 20s, Kress began using his fortune to collect Italian Renaissance art. This intersection of art and commerce helped bring about one of the most famous Kress stories in 1938, and that was that a rare painting by the Venetian Renaissance master Giorgione was placed on view in the window of the Kress Company's flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York. And perhaps this was the highest value Christmas window display of all time. 1961 witnessed the eclipse of the Kress Company when it was purchased by the Genesco Corporation, and sadly, the stores closed in 1981. Our Kress store here in Miami was located downtown on Flagler Street. The Flagler Street store shown in this image was built in 1937. And here's an image of the main shopping floor with neon signs leading the way to the mezzanine level cafeteria, which was decorated with photographs of the world's great beach resorts, very appropriate for Miami. Miami Beach also had a Kress store on Washington Avenue, which opened in 1941. Recently, it has been home to the World Erotic Art Museum, and the building still preserves its original appearance today, including the logo, which is in the sidewalk. Samuel H. Kress's passion for European paintings is one of the greatest stories in American art philanthropy. And on the screen, you can see a couple images of the collection as it was displayed in his luxurious apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York. In 1941, he donated 400 paintings and sculptures to the recently founded National Gallery of Art in Washington. After Samuel's death in 1955, his brother Rush Kress oversaw the foundation, in particular the further distribution of the collection, which by that point had grown to include over 2,000 works. And in this slide, you can see a painting that is on the wall behind you in this room in the Kress family apartment. And also in this slide, you can see one of the Lowe's paintings, which is in the room right there, as it was displayed in the library over the couch in Kress's apartment. Right. We are very fortunate at the Lowe Art Museum to be designated one of the 18 regional institutions from across the nation that were chosen to serve as collecting centers for especially generous gifts of artworks, which I already mentioned, the 48 works of art that were given to us. So that background brings us to the altarpiece that is our focus, the altarpiece by Profane. This altarpiece that we will be discussing today was purchased by Samuel H. Kress in 1943 from another great American collector, that of Philip Lehman. Much of that collection is still a major cornerstone of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The earliest that we can trace the altarpiece is into the 19th century, when it was owned by an antiquarian bookseller and occasional art dealer named Torini in Siena. It passed through the hands of two English collectors, one of whom was resident near Genoa, Italy, before it was bought by Robert Lehman sometime before 1928. While it's not possible at present to trace documentary evidence of the artwork any further back than the 19th century, the work itself does in fact give us a lot to discuss. And first, we have to answer the question, what is a medieval altarpiece? So, altarpieces are paintings made to be displayed on top of the altar, the ceremonial table that is the focal point of the Catholic Mass. The ritual at the center of the Mass is communion, consuming bread and wine in a reenactment of the Last Supper as it's described in the Gospels. Altarpieces became increasingly important as an artistic category following changes instituted by an important church council in 1215. This event, known as the Fourth Lateran Council, affirmed the belief of transubstantiation, namely that the bread and wine consumed in the ritual indeed are the body and blood of Christ. Affirmation of the doctrine also involved changes in church ritual. Before this council, the priest officiated the Mass from behind the altar, facing the congregation. After 1215, the priest performed the Mass facing the altar with his back to the audience, and he would elevate the Eucharist, as you see in this image on the screen, to visually affirm the doctrine of transubstantiation. And furthermore, congregants, quote, consumed the host visually. So at the time, just the act of looking at the host when it was elevated was you have taken communion. Full communion, actually eating the bread, only happened on Easter in that time. These changes in belief and ritual of the early 12th century made the altar a natural site for decoration with images, giving churchgoers a place to direct their attention. Altarpieces helped lay people understand the ritual taking place. And a bit more about the wider context, churches generally have a high altar, at the crossing of the nave and the transept, and then numerous other chapels with smaller altars that were paid for by individuals making pious donations. The allegiances and motivations of these various patrons would contribute to the specific subject matter chosen for a given altarpiece. So now we can answer the question, who do we see in our altarpiece? So our altarpiece is from the early 14th century, about 130 years after the changes in church culture that I just described. It's attributed to Profane, minor artist from Siena, who painted in the style of Pietro and Ambrogio Lorenzetti, great masters of the Sienese school. The frame of our altarpiece is not original, but rather a 20th century reconstruction. This image of a fresco painting, interesting, it's a fresco painting of an altarpiece, just so happens by our artist Profane, gives a better sense of what the architectural framework of an altarpiece of the time period would have looked like. So the central panel of our work shows the Virgin Mary sitting on a cushion on an inlaid marble throne with the Christ child on her lap. Christ makes the sign of blessing to two patrons or donor figures who kneel at the foot of the throne. And you can notice that they are painted on a much smaller scale than the holy figures of Christ and the Virgin. This is a standard convention of medieval art that represents the inherent hierarchy of the relationship between the human patron and the divine Christ. Two saints stand on either side, as these figures, of the central scene of the enthroned Madonna. On the left is Saint Dominic, the Spanish nobleman who founded the monastic order that bears his name, the Dominicans. Along with the Franciscans, the Dominicans were one of the mendicant, or begging orders, that transformed European society in the late Middle Ages. The Dominicans were especially dedicated to education. They were known for preaching to the populations of Europe's growing city centers. In our altarpiece, Dominic holds a lily and a book. The lily represents the monk's vow of chastity, and the book symbolizes his defense of Orthodox belief. Given his representation in this altarpiece, it is likely that it was commissioned for a Dominican convent. On the other side, we see a lesser-known saint, Elizabeth of Hungary. Elizabeth was a daughter of King Andrew II of Hungary, of the Arpad dynasty. She married Ludwig IV, the Landgraf of the central German region of Thuringia. In the altarpiece, we see Elizabeth holding her cloak in front of her, which is filled with roses. This is one of the miracles performed by the saint. The story goes that Elizabeth one day left the Landgraf's castle in secret, carrying an armful of bread in her apron to feed the poor. She was intercepted by her husband, who asked to see what she was carrying. When she opened her apron to show him, the bread had miraculously transformed into roses. She was saved from punishment by her dedication to the poor. The appearance of this particular saint in the altarpiece is the strongest clue to its patronage and provenance. While Elizabeth's piety made her a saintly role model throughout Europe, who was especially popular with the Franciscans for her dedication to the poor, she would be of central importance for any patron with a connection to the Hungarian royal family. This can help us answer the question, who are the donor figures? The young man kneeling in the foreground wears a robe and hat decorated with a pattern of fleur-de-lis, and the woman behind him wears a crown. The juxtaposition of the fleur-de-lis, which is the heraldic symbol of the kings of France, the crown, and Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, all point to a specific and fascinating context for the production of this altarpiece. That context is 14th century Naples, when the city was the capital of the Kingdom of Naples, ruled by the Angevins, who are a branch of the French royal family. So when this altarpiece was painted, Naples was in its fourth generation of Angevin rule. The descendants of Charles, Count of Anjou, the youngest brother of King Louis IX of France. In exchange for helping the Pope Clement IV defeat the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor for control of the Kingdom of Sicily, which included the city of Naples, Charles was given the privilege of ruling all of southern Italy, from Naples southwards, as king. To maintain this privilege over the years, the Angevins had to make an annual payment to the Pope of 8,000 ounces of gold. And curiously, every 3 years, they were also required to give the Pope the additional payment of a white horse. In the second generation of Angevin rule, the kingdoms of Naples and Hungary were united when Charles II married Maria, a princess of Hungary. Her daughter-in-law, the Polish princess Elizabeth Piast, is very likely the woman we see wearing a crown in our painting. Through the course of this lecture, I will help us understand this coming together of an Italian artist, a Hungarian saint, and a Polish princess who became the Dowager Queen of Hungary. As I said before, this very complex set of circumstances motivated Elizabeth, the woman in our altarpiece, to travel to Italy and commission this work. So before we seek to understand those circumstances, let us focus on the altarpiece itself and the materials that it's made out of. So what are these materials and what do they tell us about 14th century Naples? The key to understanding medieval art in general is paying close attention to what the work of art is made from. So, turning your attention to the paintings around us on the wall of this room, they are all from the Renaissance and Baroque periods. Around 1420, the Florentine artist Filippo Brunelleschi refined the drawing technique of linear perspective. This was a watershed moment in art history. Thereafter, the principal goal for many Western artists was to make paintings that fool the eye. The painting is an illusion that is supposed to look like the world as we see it. So in the case of the paintings around us, we look through the gold frame onto a distant landscape, like we're looking through a window. Medieval art, such as the altarpiece that we are discussing, was made to serve a different goal. Keep in mind the context of the church altar that I described previously. Unlike the imaginary landscapes displayed on the walls around us, medieval artists used materials to make meaning, to make images that stand in for the presence of the holy figures they depict. And this idea of like the image standing in for the presence of someone, that applies even to the donors too. So indeed, the particular visual style of 14th century Italian art is influenced by the long tradition of the Byzantine icon painting, in which the painted work of art is a stand-in for the saint, for the holy figure. And the whole idea is that this is something that clarifies for the devotional viewer where they should direct their attention in prayer and meditation. In the comparison in this slide, we can see how Lipovani painted the Madonna and Child seated on a throne, and when he did that, he was taking an established image format and reworking it to suit the needs of his patron. In this case, he's creating an image that shows the donor's devotion to Christ and the Virgin, and the blessing that they receive from Christ in return. In the case of Byzantine icons and the Italian art that followed it, painting was done in the medium of tempera on wooden panels, usually poplar wood. When we discuss the medium of painting, such as oil versus tempera, what we are referring to is the binder that holds together the dry pigment powders that give us the colors in paint. Until the 1460s, the dominant painting medium across southern Europe was tempera. And this is the technique in which, it sounds a little strange, you use the liquid yellow center of an egg yolk as your binding medium. You mix that with the dry pigment and a little bit of water, and that's how you get your paint. The result is a very fast drying medium that requires artists to build up color gradations with very small brushstrokes. It's a slow and careful form of painting that requires advanced planning. It favors exactitude over free-ranging expression. Panel paintings such as these were made by teams of specialized craftsmen in a communal workshop, where a master artist directed a team performing specialized tasks. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of this style of painting is the gold leaf that is applied to the background. The gold background presents an indeterminate space, unlike the paintings we see on the walls around us. And the material of the gold reflects the light of the painting's surroundings. The reflective gold creates the effect of a divine aura appropriate for Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the exemplary saints Dominic and Elizabeth of Hungary. So this is the symbolic meaning of the gold. But there's also the gold itself. It's, the universally valuable material. Before it could be applied to paintings in sheets so thin that the people doing the gilding actually used their breath to move it, where did the gold come from? And here's the interesting part. The gold came from coins. They had to buy coins, and there were specialized craftsmen called gold beaters, or battiloro. They would hammer the gold into sheets that thin. So understanding that the gold is like literally currency, literally coming from money, that gives the material another meaning. In addition to symbolizing the heavenly aura through its reflective quality, it is also a statement of value. It displays the wealth of the patron and also helps any viewer understand the great worth and value of the holy figures in the altarpiece. The gold applied to the background of the painting, as I've described, is an example of the material all at once, representing a range of values and concepts. So we now have another level of materials to go into, and we're talking about the representation of materials. So in the three panels of the altarpiece, we have painted depictions of different kinds of things, and I'm going to talk about two of those things. These included metalwork objects and luxurious silk fabrics. And if you were in 14th century Naples, these things would have come from very far away. And the fact that they came from very far away would have contributed to the sense of value those things had. Okay, so to continue giving us context for that, the gold, which European coins and eventually gold leaf were made from, came from sub-Saharan Africa. Most often it came from the wealthy kingdom of Mali, They had to go across the trans-Saharan trade routes and come to Italy on ships across the Mediterranean. So then after it was applied to the surface of the panel painting, it got more treatment. It was worked with different kinds of tools. It was incised with lines, and they used stamping tools called punch marks. These techniques were used to render the halos surrounding the heads of Christ, the Virgin, and the Saints Dominic and Elizabeth in our altarpiece. Analyzing the way that artists represent halos, that's a story unto itself when you look at different periods of art history. So I'll give you one quick example. Later in the Renaissance period, artists liked to make halos that looked like a delicate disc of crystal floating on top of the saint's head. Earlier 14th century artists, in contrast, seemed to be interested in giving halos a very present material quality. So first, let's define what a halo is exactly. The idea of the concept goes all the way back to classical antiquity, where it's a circle of light that represents the divinity of pagan gods. The many words used to designate halos in medieval Christian literature can help us understand the particular way that people in the 14th century would have perceived the motif. So texts use the Latin words gloria, lumen, or light, splendor, aurea, gold, corona, and crown to refer to halos. Aurea and corona have the most meaning for us in our discussion. They bring to mind valuable objects made from precious metal. And there's something interesting about the halos in this altarpiece. They have narrow outer bands of decoration that surround a large inscription. And in the image on the right, you can see the inscription highlighted so you can see it better. Okay, so you've got these outer bands of decoration surrounding the large inscription. This basic form, the round object, the large inscription, and the decoration on both sides of the inscription, would have reminded medieval viewers in Italy of a specific kind of metalwork that was highly prized at the time. So, for an example, I cite the recollection of a Florentine merchant named Simone Sigoli. When he visited Damascus, Syria, he described markets filled with brass basins and pitchers that appear of gold, and then on the said basins and pitchers are made figures and foliage and other fine work in silver, so that it is a very beautiful thing to see. Sigoli was describing Mamluk brass metalwork, which was decorated with the inlay technique. This involved inscribing your intricate design into the surface of a hammered sheet of brass. Then you would use mordant to apply ultra-thin sheets of silver to specific areas in the design. So originally, the Arabic script in this tray would have been bright silver, standing out against the darker brass background. So it's just kind of interesting. To emphasize the holiness of Christ and the saints, a 14th century Italian artist, like Lipovani, just took inspiration from luxury objects that were circulating in the economy. And those luxury objects happened to be Egyptian and Syrian metalwork table goods with very fine workmanship. Okay, I think it's easy for us to recognize gold and brass metalwork with inlaid silver as valuable things, but textiles might stand out a bit less to us. I think in our present day lives we take textiles for granted. We get up and we put on our t-shirt and we don't think about it. In the medieval world, textiles would have been much more important and had the potential to say a lot more. One context that will help us understand this is the trade landscape of Europe. So the economy within Europe was dominated by the material of wool. Wool was grown, it came from sheep in England. The raw material was bought and sold in French trade fairs, and then it was woven into fine fabrics that were finished and brightly dyed in Italy. So as important as wool was, even more valuable, even more rarefied, was silk. Silk has unique qualities that are very highly valued across cultures. It's first produced in China over 4,000 years ago. So some of those qualities that are so highly valued. It's very lightweight, but at the same time durable. The silk threads have that nice luminous quality. On top of all that, it holds dye very well, so you can get these very brightly colored fabrics. And if all that weren't enough, it's incredibly difficult to make. You have to raise the silkworms, you have to kill them in their cocoons, you have to extract the threads from the cocoons, you have to wind those filaments into a thread, and then you have to weave the thread into cloth. That required a lot of specialized knowledge that contributed to the material's value. So across the centuries, people in Europe are desperate to get their hands on this wonderful fabric that comes from very far away in Asia. Especially important is the region of present-day Iran. At the time, in the time period we're talking about, that was a part of the Mongol Empire. And in this region, they had a particular kind of loom called the draw loom, and that allowed you to weave these elaborately patterned fabrics. You have, every fabric has a warp and a weft. With a draw loom, you get two wefts, so that's how you get your very nice detailed pattern. The richest fabrics had their detailed patterns made with golden thread. So, as I already described, for centuries people want to get their hands on these fabrics, and eventually the Italians developed their own silk production scene that's based in the cities of Lucca and Venice. So you have an interesting cultural dynamic happening where you have patterns being made in Asia, you have Italians copying those patterns, and you have a back and forth exchange of the decorative styles that's kind of going both ways across the Silk Road. Okay, so now let's talk about the fabrics that we see represented in the altarpiece. So the Virgin Mary, she's wearing a blue mantle over a red robe. Both the red robe and the lining of the mantle have detailed patterns. The pattern on the robe are similar to surviving textile fragments that art historians label the tiny pattern style. Textiles of this type were produced in China in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. The example shown here is an especially sumptuous one. This shows you what it looks like when the supplementary weft pattern is woven with gold thread. Gold thread is a whole topic unto itself that I won't get into for the sake of time. All right, on to Elizabeth of Hungary and her pattern. So this is closer to the designs that were common in the Italian silk industry. They tended to feature vegetal motifs like plants and flowers and networks of vines. Often these would be populated with birds and fantastic beasts. So here are some surviving examples of what those textiles could look like. Okay. So the pattern textiles worn by the saints in this altarpiece invest in this sense of honor and power. This draws on the long-standing medieval social practice of using textiles to represent your authority, to show off, in short. Sultans and emperors would appear to visitors enthroned against a backdrop of expensive textiles. Other evidence that we have includes treasury inventories and descriptions of European coronations, where you get detailed descriptions of the fabrics, and often enough indication that they understood where these fabrics came from. And they really liked to point out when the fabrics came from the Mongol Empire. Those were the good ones. They called them the Pani Tartarici. Okay, so I've taken you through the altarpiece. I've taken us very close in. We've talked about materials. Now let's answer the question, what can these materials tell us about the context of 14th century Naples? So now we get to journey to Naples. So the halos reminiscent of Mamluk metalwork, the Asian and Italian silks, all these things would have been right at home in 14th century Naples. The Angevin rulers presided over a cosmopolitan center that was one of the leading cities in Europe. The founder of the dynasty, Charles I, married Beatrice, Countess of Provence. So this meant that in addition to all of southern Italy, they also controlled the region of Provence in southern France, which is a very strategically important area. And it also happened to include the city of Avignon, which is the seat of the papacy beginning in 1305. So that's just a little citation to tell you how powerful these people were. They could even call themselves the kings or queen of Jerusalem, as the founder of the dynasty also purchased the right to have that title in 1277. And this was an expression of his desire to grow his kingdom even into an empire that expanded all the way into the east. While that was never realized, it certainly contributed to a very cosmopolitan outlook for the culture of the kingdom. So their court attracted architects and artists such as Giotto, who developed Naples into a great city that hosted ambassadors and merchants from far and wide. The writers Petrarch and Boccaccio both had periods of residence in the city, where they helped found a vibrant literary culture. In the 1320s, Naples was on par with Paris, Venice, and Milan as one of only 4 cities in Europe with a population of more than 100,000. It was a nexus of trade routes that connected the coastal cities of the Mediterranean with Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So after designating Naples the capital of his kingdom in 1284, what did Charles I do? He developed trade infrastructure. He built public marketplaces for buying and selling goods, and he built even housing for communities of foreign merchants. And he even expanded into other places. He built a trade depot in Tunis. So that gives you a sense of the broad reach of this city in the global trade of the time. And that I will stop there and continue. So I want to show you quickly 2 interesting examples that resulted from that broad reach of trade. And of course, you don't have just trade, but you have diplomatic relationships too. So these generations of kings maintained diplomatic relationships with Muslim emirs in Africa, with the kings of Serbia, Albania, even with the Khans of the Mongol Empire. One way you maintain those relationships is by giving gifts, and we call that diplomatic gift giving. So what you see on the screen is an example of a diplomatic gift. This is from the Emir of Tunis. It was presented to Charles I, and it is a manuscript of the medical encyclopedia of the Persian doctor Al-Razi. It was translated into Latin by the Persian Jewish scholar Faraj ben Salam. So that's just one little thing, all at once, shows you the many cultures that we're meeting in this place. Another great example, another reserve of detailed knowledge comes from the inventory that was taken at a will when one of the queens died, and in fact it's Queen Maria of Hungary. She died in 1326. Textiles feature prominently in the inventory of her estate. Wool from Ireland, silks from both Italy and Central Asia, but perhaps, for people that study art history and get excited about materials, we're incredibly excited that 2 ceramics that she had are described as de porcellana, and that is the earliest reference that we have in the European inventory to Chinese porcelain. So the first time that we know of, the people in Europe are recognizing the really important material for world history that's porcelain. Okay, let's keep working our way through medieval Naples and imagine ourselves being there. So it's multicultural, it's vibrant, it's beautiful. You can imagine nobles taking the waters at the ancient Roman baths of Baia just outside the city, or enjoying sailing trips along cliff-lined coasts. And in fact, scenes such as these are praised in the writings of Petrarch and Boccaccio. You can picture city and castle interiors decorated in the French Gothic style, and you can picture courtiers wearing gold jewelry and long, brightly colored gowns like the people you see having a good time in the image on the screen. Maybe this is my favorite detail to imagine what it would be like. By the 4th generation, the use of French as the dominant language had given way to a new hybrid literary vernacular that was a fusion of French with Sicilian, Tuscan, and Tuscan dialects. So that gives you a sense of what this place was like. And of course, you can imagine it's a place where dramatic stories could unfold. And many such stories did unfold in relation to the succession of the Neapolitan throne, which is our next topic. So thus far, I've painted a happy picture of the wealthy multicultural kingdom of Naples, but in the time period that we're discussing, the Angevins had a problem. And that problem was that a woman, Queen Johanna I, was sitting on the throne as the sole ruler. Of course, that's not a problem in itself from our point of view in 2025, but it was certainly a problem in the minds of most people in the early 1300s. And in many ways, it was a problem even for Queen Johanna herself. Because she was ruling alone, according to the unusual terms of the last will and testament of her grandfather, Robert the Wise, her position was hotly contested. She was under constant threat. And yet, despite that difficulty, she wouldn't want to solve the problem. She wouldn't want to give up all the power that she has as the sole ruler. So for this reason, her husband, Prince Andrew of Hungary, who's a young man, shown in our altarpiece, was relegated to a stagnant life in Naples as a royal consort with no official power. Okay, so how did we get to this impasse? What does it have to do with our altarpiece? Here's where it's going to get the most complicated. To answer that question, I propose meeting the Angevins as they wanted themselves to be seen in a work of art that they commissioned. So the image on the screen is the frontispiece of the Anjou Bible, commissioned by King Robert the Wise in Naples from his court illuminator around the same time as our altarpiece. Illuminated Bibles were often given as instructive gifts to young monarchs at the start of their reign. So, we're going to go through the genealogy using this image. In the top register sits Charles I, who was first granted the privilege of ruling the kingdom. He sits opposite Beatrice of Provence, who enriched the kingdom with her inherited territory. The figure kneeling at the feet of Charles I is his son, Charles II, naturally, representing the next generation of Angevin rule. In the middle register, Charles II sits on the throne opposite Maria of Hungary. Okay, the marriage between this generation, this is where all the problems start. This is where the conflicts begin. The marriage between Charles II and Maria of Hungary, it was meant to be a fortuitous union that brought together two very powerful royal families. However, we have a problem, common problem at the time, a tragic, sad problem. The heirs died early. So the eldest son, let me take a pause to orient myself. Okay, however, things become complicated with this third generation. That is all represented here by these three guys that are standing to the right of the throne. The eldest son, they are wearing a crown, Charles Martel, and his wife died tragically of illness in 1295. Even though he died young, he had already had a son named Charles Robert, and he is known to history as Carobert. According to the right of primogeniture, which was standard practice amongst the courts of Europe, that next generation, Carobert, he actually should have been next in line for the throne. However, because he was so young, and also eligible for the throne of Hungary through descent from his grandmother, Queen Maria of Hungary, Charles II of Naples consulted with Pope Boniface VIII and decided that placing one of his own sons on the throne instead, this guy over here, would promote security in the whole region because it would maintain a stable line of succession from this one family. That was at least the justification. Even another level of complication, you can see a man standing between them. He doesn't have a crown, he has a halo. That's because he abdicated his right to the throne because he was passionately dedicated to the Franciscan cause. He would eventually become Saint Louis of Toulouse. And both of these saints, something I won't get into, but it's a very big deal. They're very proud to have a saint in their family, and that even contributes to their power and status in a real way. Okay, so we've got the beginning of the conflict there in the second register with these three guys. And those are their sons, kneeling there. I won't say anything more about them. I will just get us to the last register. Focus on the idea that these guys die young. Primogeniture has not been preserved. Right. Okay, so we are in the last register. Right. Let me begin. I'm having to continue to orient myself. Let's get to the last register. We have Robert the Wise, his second wife, Sancha of Mallorca. Okay, the young guys kneeling here, they die too. 2 generations of deaths. But basically the situation is, okay. So we have this king and queen. They are the grandparents. Their granddaughter is Johanna I. We've lost all the heirs. If we want to keep the Angevin succession going, Johanna is the only option. The main conflict is the Hungarians have a legitimate claim to the throne, and that's known and agreed upon across Europe. Maybe it's just a matter that the Angevins over there in Naples are crafty and have enough money and have the Pope in their pocket with that annual tribute they pay and the occasional white horse, that they've got enough influence to keep themselves, in a position of privilege. So, Robert the Wise, is able to pull off this move of designating his granddaughter the sole heir in his will. Okay, so bringing us to that last register, Robert the Wise, his second wife Sancha of Majorca. Over here is Johanna the First, the future queen, her younger sister Maria. And as it is understood, agreed upon by historians, that this young man kneeling at the feet of Robert the Wise and even kissing his feet is Andrew of Hungary, the man that we see in our altarpiece here at the Lowe. Okay, good. With only a couple stops for reorienting, we've gotten through the complicated genealogy and the beginning of the conflict. Okay. So let's bring our attention back to our donor figures, now that we mostly understand the complexities of the Neapolitan succession. Okay, the woman wearing the crown. This is Elizabeth of Poland, the wife of the maligned heir of the Neapolitans who's sitting on the throne of Hungary, the maligned heir Cadobert. So, with that stalemate that we were dealing with, in fact, I forget one part, brings us to the two young women over here. Okay, the Pope intervenes, another Pope with another name, we don't need to know which Pope, just another Pope. He intervenes and he says, okay, this is the solution. We're going to make a double marriage. Johanna gets to marry the Prince of Hungary. He's going to be given the title of king. He gave in to the Neapolitans' demand. Even though he gets the title of king, he doesn't rule. The younger sister, Maria, marries Louis of Hungary. Then she becomes Queen of Hungary. So we think this is all going to work out. Everybody thinks, everybody agrees. So that brings us back to our donors. Everybody agrees to this arrangement of the double engagement, the future double marriage. So, Elizabeth Piast, who by now she's the Dowager Queen of Hungary, she dutifully sends her son to Naples to be married to Johanna. And this happens, and it's basically a long story of not working out, of him being stuck there. Imagine, so Hungary, it's a very wealthy kingdom, much smaller population than Naples, much more rural. So imagine this crowd of Hungarians coming over to the beautiful Italian, French, cosmopolitan city of Naples and just not fitting in. And this poor guy, Andrew, has to be married to Johanna, and he just kind of sits there for years. So you have this situation where you have the Hungarians, both the Hungarians who were there, the royal Hungarians over there in Hungary, everybody's fighting to try, saying like, okay, finally, you need to crown him. You need to give him the crown. You need to give him the right to rule. The Neapolitans finally give in. They say they are going to crown him. But there's always this duplicity, and it seems that they never were going to honor this idea that he would get to rule. Okay, so that brings us finally to the altarpiece. How and why did it get made? So Elizabeth, she's over there in Hungary. She's getting reports about her son's bad situation over there in Naples. She says, I need to do something about this. So she sets out on a trip to Italy. Ostensibly, it's a pious pilgrimage. She's going to visit the shrines of St. Peter's in Rome. She's going to visit the shrine of St. Nicholas in Bari. Each place she stops, she's going to make a pious donation. One of those donations, this reliquary, is even still there in the treasury in the church in Bari in Italy today. And it is very likely that our altarpiece was made on this journey, somewhere on this journey. Could have been made in Rome, could have been made in Bari, but most likely it was probably made in Naples. So I've already described for us early in the talk how that's represented by the presence of St. Elizabeth of Hungary from the royal family of Hungary, representing their lineage and connection to that saint. And then also, of course, the Dominican saint. So in Naples, even very close to the royal palace, we have a Dominican convent, and who founded the Dominican convent? Queen Maria of Hungary, who, of course, this woman is the daughter-in-law of. So you can picture her traveling to Naples. She's saying she's there on a pious pilgrimage, but of course, why is she really there? She's there to pull strings. She's there to advocate for her son. So this altarpiece is a part of that campaign of advocacy. It's playing out in politics, it's playing out in spending money, but it's also playing out in genuine religious devotion in this altarpiece. I mean, this really does represent her prayer for her son's safety. So she's there in Naples, and here's the kind of dramatic meeting and conflict that brings us to the end of our story. So she's there in Naples. She sends emissary to the Pope in Avignon, a group of high-level ambassadors pleading, finally, you need to crown Andrew the king. The Pope does agree, but basically the stalemate continues. He says, okay, yes, he will be crowned king, but he will not rule. The Pope actually specifies that. So basically the stalemate continues. We get to this kind of calm. I can call it the calm before the storm. The coronation is scheduled. What happens before the coronation? Our poor young guy, Andrew, who through all of this is only 17 years old, by the way. Johanna's only 18 years old. Everything seemed to be at peace, but clearly someone had a big, ugly scheme in mind, and he's murdered. Brutally murdered, just before the coronation. Not just murdered, strangled, mutilated, thrown out of a window. So sadly, we get a very sad end to our story. But maybe there's a sense of I don't know, we want to say this. The tragedy continues. Johanna gets to sit on the throne. She reigns for over 30 more years, but when she's 56 years old, she meets the same end. She's also murdered. She's suffocated in a prison cell, ostensibly because of her commitment to one of the two competing popes. So imagine all of this. You get to a point where there are two people claiming to be pope. We won't even get into that. That's a story for another video. Ostensibly, that's the reason for her murder. But of course, the real reason is so her children did not survive. She designated a high-level, powerful relative from over in France to be her heir. Of course, local relations who were closer to her in their family relationship were very unhappy about that and believed that they should be on the throne. So a local duke is the one who ordered her murder. And so that, sadly, has become Johanna's legacy in history. She's kind of the queen plagued by murder, the murder she is reputed to have ordered, and the murder that was ordered against her. Interestingly, modern historians actually tend to vindicate her because she really didn't earn anything from Andrew's death. But I didn't even go into the struggle between the Neapolitans and the Hungarians. There's 3 more families there in Naples who are all fighting for their sons to get on the throne. So, I'm at the time that I was intended to fill. I hope that you have enjoyed our journey to Naples through the complicated politics surrounding this altarpiece that is certainly a meeting of sacred and profane. So, thank you.